Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Hi. Good afternoon. So welcome to the comprehensive view of speech processing. So this is lecture 5, and in this lecture we will discuss about acoustic phonetic representation of sound units. So we discuss about the acoustic phonetic representation of speech sounds. So far in the previous lectures we discussed about the introduction related to the speech processing, and we also discussed about the speech production and perception mechanisms from the human perspective, and in today's lecture we will try to discuss about acoustic phonetic representation of various sound units. So before going to the discussion of the acoustic phonetic representation of various sound units, so first we will discuss very briefly about when you look at the, because here basically the objective of this lecture is that in the speech signal is nothing but the acoustic pressure variations. So, and the speech signal is a resultant of the production of different sound units in sequence as per the sequence of words. So, for each sound unit is produced with various the articulatory constraints and with various excitation source requirements and all, and we will see that in the acoustic signal how these the constraints offered by various articulators, how they are reflected and how they are present in the acoustic signal. So that we will see, that we will observe in this lecture and all. And since the acoustic signal we cannot directly visualize that, so therefore we will see the electrical equivalent of that signal. It is nothing but captured by microphone, and that electrical signal will be analyzed in both time and frequency domains, and we will see that, so whatever this articulatory like the manifestations for various sounds, how they are reflected in the signal, so that we will observe in this particular lecture. Here if you look at in this particular slide, a speech signal has been displayed, and here this for the sake of clear presentation, this is a speech signal corresponds to a phrase its time, and this is the length of the duration of the speech signal is about 500 milliseconds, and for the purpose of display and for the clarity of a presentation, the 500 millisecond speech signal is splitted into 5 parts, each of 100 milliseconds. And now you can able to see in this figure there are 5 sub figures, each corresponds to 100 milliseconds. You can see that this particular is 100 millisecond, so it corresponds to 1000 samples, and this is corresponds to again 100 milliseconds, 1000 samples. So therefore you can see here the sample starts from sample 1 to sample 1000, and here is a 1001 to 2000, and likewise the other subplots corresponds to, each of them corresponds to 1000 samples, and it is 100 milliseconds. It means that here the signal is sampled at 10 kilobits, 10k, that means 10,000 samples per second. Here the signal is sampled at 10,000 samples per second, and that is the reason that you can see that each subplot is 100 milliseconds and it corresponds to 1000 samples. And now if you look at this, this is a time domain representation of a signal for the speech, for the speech phrase corresponds to its time. And if you look at this particular signal, you can able to see that at some portions where the signal having very low amplitude, almost like there is no signal at all, and at some portions you can have a signal of some random fluctuations, you can see here, and so on. And whereas at some places you can able to see the signal having some periodic pattern, right. So you can see somewhere here in the second plot and in the fourth and fifth plot, you can see some signal having a pattern is repeating, it's kind of a periodic pattern. So when you look at the signal, this signal is basically corresponds to a speech of its time, and so this was captured by microphone, and the time and that signal has been displayed over here, and this is the duration of this signal is the total duration of this signal is 0.5 second. It's a 500 millisecond, and for the sake of display and to see the details clearly, instead of displaying the 500 milliseconds in one stage, so that we divided into the 5 parts, each of 100 milliseconds, and that was displayed one below the other. So with that you can able to see that more detailed the fluctuations of the signal, and more detailed characteristics of a signal you can able to observe. So from this signal, as I mentioned, that there are at some places it appears that there is no signal at all, right, but there is no, you can see that hardly there is no amplitude over here, and at some places you can have some random fluctuations were there. You can see here, here and here, like plots, subplots 2, 3, 4, where you have some random fluctuations at some places, and subplots again 2, 4 and 5, you can see a signal having somewhat higher amplitude, and a kind of some pattern was repeating, right. And here if you observe in a time domain signal, in some subplots like subplot 2 and 4 and 5, and you can see that a periodic pattern or a pattern is repeating. So it means that you can say that it's a kind of a periodic signal. That means the same period is repeating, or the same pattern is repeating successively. So it's a periodic part of the signal, and here also you can able to observe there are some 2 or 3 periods over here in the second plot, whereas the third plot at the end, you can fourth subplot, where you can see there are like 3 to 4 periods over here, and in the last subplot, like in at the bottom one, fifth subplot, where the entire signal is a periodic one kind of a thing. But here you can see, and again the shape of the signal is varying, that half of the signal having a periodicity where we have some kind of a pattern, whereas the remaining half we have some slight change in the shape in the signal. And here in the speech signal, this periodic part of the signal in the time domain, it's known to be like a voiced speech signal, because here you are getting or you are observing this periodicity or periodic pattern in the speech signal because of the periodic excitation or because of the voiced excitation. Because as we have in the last class we discussed that the speech is result of 3 types of excitation, right? Voiced excitation, unvoiced excitation and mixed excitation. It is a combination of those two. In case of voiced excitation, that results due to the vocal folds vibration, because as we know that the speech is always produced due to exhalation of air during exhalation phase of air, and in the exhalation phase again the smooth exhalation of phase will not result any speech at all. So we need to constrain the exhalation of air in certain fashion so that it becomes an excitation, and that excitation when it propagates through the oral cavity or a nasal cavity, then it results in speech. And here in this case the periodic pattern in the speech signal is observed because of the speech resulted due to the voiced excitation. It means the speech resulted due to the vocal folds vibration. So because of vocal folds vibration, the exhalation of air will be transformed into a sequence of narrow pulses, and these narrow pulses will propagate through a oral cavity or a nasal cavity. Then according to the shape of the oral cavity or vocal tract, then the characteristics or the appropriate resonances will be excited, and those resonances will be superimposed on these pulses. So that results the signal something like this. So therefore in the time domain signal, if you observe the periodicity, it means that so this signal is result of, it's a voiced speech. This is a result of due to the voiced excitation, and whereas at other parts you can see that a signal having some amplitude, some smaller amplitude, but there is some random fluctuations, a noise kind of a thing. You can able to observe here in the second subplot at the beginning, and in the third subplot at the middle, and in the case of fourth subplot also here in the middle portion, you can see there is some random fluctuations that is observed in the time domain signal, and these random fluctuations are due to noise excitation or due to the unvoiced excitation. We know that the unvoiced excitation is the result of a complete closure of the speech production system at some point in the oral cavity, right, and then afterwards a sudden release of the constriction acts like excitation. So, due to the sudden release of that constriction, then the air will be rushed through that like the narrow opening, and with that it creates like a turbulence noise, and that way you can able to perceive the noise in the speech signal and all. So, this is unvoiced. You can see here it was marked as labeled as U. So, wherever it labeled as U, it means that it is unvoiced excitation. The speech segment or the speech signal is due to the unvoiced excitation, right. And yeah, you can see at some portions you can see that almost like you can see that there is not much amplitude, there is not much significant amplitude is observed. So, that is because of pauses or like there is no speech at all, because when you are speaking it is not that all the time we speak. So, in between the words or in between the phrases we leave some pauses. So, during the pause there is no speech activity at all. So, therefore, there is no signal. There is no signal means you can see that amplitude of the signal will be very low. So, that way you can view this as the silence. S means this is the silence portion. So, likewise in a time domain speech signal you can able to see that there are certain segments which has there is no signal at all, otherwise the signal having very insignificant amplitude, and there are certain portions where the signal having some smaller amplitude with like random fluctuation noise. So, that is due to the unvoiced speech, and there are other portions where the signal having repeated patterns are observed, and that is due to the voiced speech. The resultant speech is a voiced speech. So, directly by looking at the speech signal in a time domain, we can able to see that whether the speech is due to the voiced excitation or due to the unvoiced excitation, or it is a pause, there is no signal at all. So, beyond that we cannot discriminate much, because here this is a voice excitation, and as we know that this voice excitation will be there for all the vowels. So, by looking at this pattern it will be very difficult to comment on, very difficult to say that whether this speech segment corresponds to which voice segment, that means which sound the speech signal corresponds to is difficult to judge or difficult to comment by looking at the time domain signal and all, because from time domain signal you can see a periodicity and there is some fluctuations at the different shapes in the signal, but with that we cannot discriminate or we cannot comment, we cannot like in a deterministic way we can't say that which sound unit it corresponds to. Like in the same way for unvoiced case also there are several unvoiced sounds are there, right. So, we have seen in the last lecture. So, there are different unvoiced sounds, but here due to this random fluctuations we do not comment or we do not say confidently which unvoiced sound corresponds to these segments and all. So, therefore, from time domain signal we can able to observe or we can able to clearly make out whether the speech is a voiced speech or unvoiced speech or it is a silent or a pauses. So, only these variations or these details you can able to observe from a time domain signal. If you want to see a discrimination or if you want to like determine the sound units to some extent, it's you can able to see those details better in the frequency domain representation of a signal and all, in the frequency domain representation of a signal. So, yeah, here this is the plot corresponds to a signal, a speech signal corresponds to a sentence here, every salt breeze comes from the sea. You can see here this is a plot figure where it contains 3 subplots. So, the bottom plot corresponds to a time domain signal, right, the signal displayed in a time domain, and the upper 2 plots corresponds to the spectrograms corresponds to this particular signal. We will see what is mean by spectrogram and all. And here this particular signal, time domain signal, so this is stretch over around 2 seconds close to, right, and this signal corresponds to a speech phrase corresponds to every salt breeze comes from the sea, right. So, for that particular speech utterance, so this is the corresponding signal in a time domain. So, from this time domain signal, so one can able to observe that you can see the signal amplitude is varying, and at certain portions the signal amplitude is higher, and at certain portions the signal amplitude is very low, right, and at certain portions where the signal is somewhat random, and here the signal, you can see here the signal duration is about 2 seconds. So, as we are seeing, suppose the signal is sampled at 10 kilohertz, it means that now we are displaying almost like a 20,000 samples in this duration, in this length. So, that is the reason that you can't see the periodicity very clearly here. If you zoom this signal in horizontally, or if you stretch the signal horizontally, right, you can able to see the periodic patterns. So, from that patterns you can able to see here, you can see here the peaks here with the separated striations kind of a thing. So, these things corresponds to the periodic patterns. So, wherever the higher amplitude was there, mostly those regions are corresponds to a periodic patterns, right. That's nothing but it's a voiced speech. And there is a signal, if you look at here, here this gap, and here this gap, and here there is a gap over here. So, these gaps corresponds to pauses, and here if you look at here, before this voiced signal there is some random fluctuation over here, and here also before this voiced signal there is a random fluctuation, and here also there is a random fluctuation over here, the entire thing, and here also. So, all these random fluctuations are due to the unvoiced speech. So, because here we know that this particular speech signal contains some unvoiced sounds, because every like v, r, s, t, b, r, j, k, so m. So, all these are unvoiced sounds, right. So, these unvoiced sounds are manifested as the, like you can see that in the speech signal, the random fluctuations whatever before this voiced sounds are nothing but those unvoiced sounds, and in general the duration of unvoiced sound is very less, much lesser compared to the voiced sounds, much less because you can also experience, if you want to like produce unvoiced sound, it is very short duration, because suppose k, k. So, the k is observed actually when you block the oral cavity at a velum, and afterwards sudden release of that, at that instant very small duration you can able to, that is the result of a sound unit k, k, k. When you say ka, that means it is a consonant followed by the vowel a, both were there. There are two sound units in the when you utter ka, ka. In that ka, it is a two sound units. The first sound unit is the consonant k, and then the following sound unit is the vowel an. So, that way if you look at that, if you observe that, so the consonants having very small durations, and the vowels have much larger durations. Vowels have the durations about 100 milliseconds to about 50 milliseconds. It will go up to 200 to 50 milliseconds, even 300 milliseconds and more also. Whereas the consonants have very small duration. It's about like very small, like less than 10 milliseconds, right? Less than 10 milliseconds or 10 to 20 milliseconds maximum. Okay, so this is your time domain signal, and now these two are the spectrograms. So, spectrograms means plotting the spectrum of the signal, So, here if you look at this particular speech signal, it is varying in time, that is the signal characteristics are varying in time. So, therefore, computing a frequency transform for this particular signal in one time by using just by applying Fourier transform directly for the whole signal, then the purpose is not served, because here the signal is not stationary signal, it is not stationary signal, right. The signal is non-stationary, it means the signal characteristics are changing with respect to time, because we know that this entire speech utterance is constituted by the sequence of words like every salt breeze comes from the sea. So, this is consists of like there are several sound units are there. So, in these 2 seconds of speech utterance, there are like multiple sounds are there, there are about like 20 to 30 sounds or maybe more are there, right. For every sound unit it has its own characteristics. So therefore this particular time domain signal is time varying, that means with respect to time, as according to the sound unit, the characteristics of the waveform or the signal is varying. So therefore, it's not wise to take a Fourier transform for the entire signal. If you take a Fourier transform for the entire signal, you will get the frequency components corresponds to the entire signal. You don't see how the frequency properties, or how the what are the frequency components for different sound units, all those things you don't observe. You will see the resultant of the entire, all the sound units together can be observed if you take a Fourier transform directly. So therefore, since it is a non-stationary signal, we can't take the Fourier transform directly. So instead we have to take a Fourier transform. Always the Fourier transform has to be applied on a stationary signal, right. So since it is a non-stationary signal, so therefore we need to apply a Fourier transform on a shorter segments, on a very short segment. That means if you take a duration of about 20 milliseconds, right, 20 to 30 milliseconds, then we can see that almost during that smaller duration the signal appears to be stationary. That means there won't be much variations in the signal and all. So that way we can for computing the spectrum for this time domain signal, so what we do is that we will apply a Fourier transform on a shorter segments known to be frames. It's close, it's roughly about 10 to 20 milliseconds or 10 to 30 milliseconds kind of a thing. So that way we will split this entire speech signal into a sequence of frames, and for every frame we compute a Fourier transform. And Fourier transform is nothing but by applying a Fourier transform you can able to visualize that. So for that particular 20 millisecond segment, what are the frequency components that are present, and for every frequency component what is the strength of that particular frequency. That means I think of frequency is nothing but a sinusoidal signal of that particular frequency, right. So here the frequency domain is nothing but for a given speech signal or for a given time domain signal, if you compute a Fourier transform, then we will come to know that the various frequency components that contributes to this particular signal and all. So for every frequency component or for every frequency, what is the strength or what is its amplitude or what is the energy that associated to that particular frequency component. So that was the information provided by the Fourier transform. So since it is a non-stationary signal, we will divide this signal into frames, sequence of frames, overlapping frames, right. Every frame duration will be roughly about, as I mentioned, like 20 milliseconds, and then we will move this frame by like for every 1 millisecond and so on, so that you can able to see that for every frame we will get the spectrum, that is nothing but the frequency components and its corresponding energies. And likewise, suppose for example, if you move the window or if you move the frame by for every 1 millisecond, so since it has 2 seconds, that means there are about how many 2000 milliseconds are there. That means this total signal is divided into 2000 frames. Each frame duration equals to 20 milliseconds, but they are overlapped frames. That means the first frame will be like 0 to 20 millisecond, and the next frame will be like 1 to 21, and next frame will be like 2 to 22. Likewise, we will shift the frame with an overlap of 1 millisecond, and that means from first frame to second frame there is a overlap of 19 milliseconds. That means we just shift by 1 millisecond. So therefore the remaining 19 milliseconds of first frame is common with the second frame, the beginning of 19 milliseconds. So that way we will divide the speech signal into the multiple frames. For every frame we will compute the spectrum is nothing but the frequency components, and for every frequency whatever the strength, whatever the energy that possesses that particular frequency, and that strength is also represented. So that way here the spectrograms are nothing but like stacking the spectrum of the consecutive frames of this particular speech signal and all, because as I told you that this speech signal is splitted into like 2000 frames, like 2000 frames, because for every 1 millisecond I have a frame of duration of 20 milliseconds, right. So therefore there are total 2000 frames. So now I will compute the Fourier transform for these 2000 frames separately. For every frame when I compute Fourier transform, then I will get a list of frequencies, and for every frequency what is the strength or what is the energy it possesses, all that information I can find it. And now the spectrogram is nothing but stacking all this spectral information in a consecutive way. So that is known to be spectrogram. So here the spectrogram, you can able to observe there are three types of information that is present in the spectrogram. So one is that actually we are computing the spectrum for every frame, right, and then we are stacking those frames with the time alignment to the time domain signal. So therefore the spectrogram gives you the, with respect to time, how the spectrum is varying. That the spectrum is nothing but what are the various frequency components that are present in a signal at a particular time, like, so that way here the spectrogram contains, one is the timing information, and second one is the frequency content that is present in that particular signal at that particular instant, and then at that particular instant what are the frequency components are present, and for each frequency what is the energy that is associated. So therefore there are total three types of information that the spectrogram corresponds to. One is the timing information, and other one is the frequencies that are present at a given instant, and then the strengths of the various frequency components are the energy that is associated to various frequency components. But here we are representing that in a two-dimensional plot, right. So that is the reason here you can see that this particular spectrogram, there are two spectrograms, I will tell you later, and here each spectrogram is plotted on a two-dimensional plot, but it indicates the three-dimensional information. So one is the timing, the time domain information, that is nothing but the temporal information, and the other one is the frequency. You can see that here, since the signal is sampled at 10 kilohertz, so therefore the frequency components that can be observed is up to 5000, because we know that as per the Nyquist theorem, if the signal is sampled at a particular frequency or at a particular rate, then the frequencies that will be observed will be half of the sampling rate. So here in this case the signal is sampled at like 10,000 samples per second, right. So therefore the frequency components that will be observed, that can be analyzed, will be up to 5000. So you can able to see that a frequency component up to 5000 you are plotted here, and here along with the frequency components, for every frequency component it has some energy. That means if here frequency component is nothing but a sinusoidal, right, a sinusoidal. So there are multiple sinusoidals will be resulting a particular time domain signal, and each sinusoidal has its own strength, it has different amplitudes. So those amplitudes of the sinusoidals or frequency components are represented by using a gray scale. That means white color to the dark color or black color. So different shades between the white to black, right. So with the different gray shades we can able to represent the strength, like whatever the minimum strength and maximum strength will take, and that will be divided into like as many levels as possible between white to black and all. So with the different gray shades you can able to observe. So from that we will come to know that here is that way here is a three-dimensional representation. One is the temporal information, the time axis, and other one is the frequency, and the third one is that the gray shade or the gray color that is observed here that indicates the third dimension, that is energy that is associated to different frequency components. So now if you look at here, for example, here for this in this time domain signal at the beginning you have like what is this is every solid breeze comes from the sea. So there is nothing but A, the first sound unit of this particular speech utterance is A. So it's a vowel, right. So it's a voiced sound. So that you can able to see that corresponds to the higher amplitude and periodicity of that one. And here for this particular sound unit, if you can observe that, so the spectral components are varying from 0 to 4 kilohertz, right, 0 to 4 kilohertz, and you can see that as the dark color as the here the color of the spectrogram, or you can see that the darkness of the spectrogram at certain portions the regions are darker, and at certain portions the regions are gray color and white color also there. White color means at those regions the signal amplitude is, or you can say that the frequency components having very low energy and all, almost like. So you can see here, even though you sampled at 5 kilohertz, but beyond 4 kilohertz there are frequency components, but those frequency components having insignificant energy. That is the reason that here you can see it's almost like a white color, right. So the white color indicates the minimum energy or the lowest energy, and the dark color indicate the darkest, or the thick black color indicates that the highest energy. So in between you have a different gray shades. So accordingly, suppose if, based on the energy strength, you can appropriately you can the corresponding color or corresponding gray shade, we can able to identify the different frequency components and all. So if you look at here at certain portions here, for example, here in this case you can see here. So here a very salt breeze, maybe here it corresponds to breeze. So therefore here first corresponds to bar, where you can see that almost like there is no low frequency content at all, and here there is some high frequency content, right, because you can see here in the 0 to 4 kilohertz up to almost like a 1500 hertz, it's almost like a white color. It means that the frequency components it contains, but the frequency components have very insignificant energy. That is the reason that we have a very bright or you can say a white color, and afterwards we have at a higher range around 4 kilohertz or 3 kilohertz, between 3 to 4, it has a dark color. It means that the frequency components having higher energy and all. And likewise here, for example, if you look at here, there is no frequency component at all here. So because that is a pause, maybe because here when you utter the sentence after these 2 or 3 words, we have given some pause, right. That means we have not uttered anything. So that's why you can able to see here there is a complete white. It means that there is no signal at all, right. It's a pause. That's why there is no signal. So there is no frequency components at all, right. So that way here you can able to see that there are some darker patches, bands, right, and again these darker bands also like having different shapes, and all these things, the darker bands and darker the shapes of these darker bands, this is because of the sound unit, the production of sound unit. Because when you utter the sound unit, you keep your vocal tract shape will be having different shape according to the different sounds it producing. Like for example, when you are producing ah, where you open the oral cavity very wider, so that results a particular frequency components having a dominant energy at a particular ranges, right. So when you utter oo, for example, it has a different shape, like, so accordingly a certain frequency components will dominate, will take more energy, and those frequency components will be dominant for the production of that particular sound unit. So therefore here the darker bands corresponds to those frequencies having a significant energy compared to other frequencies. For example, if you look at here in this region, this particular sound unit, right. So for this particular sound unit, you can see that there are certain there is a darker region at a lower range. That means lower range means like below 500 there is a darker region. It means that the frequency components from at a lower range having the higher energy, and afterwards in between there is no it's a white. It means that the other frequency component from almost like a 300 to almost like 2000, close to 2000. So those frequency components have very insignificant energy, or that means very less energy, right, compared to this one. And again around 2000 to 2500, again we have some frequencies which have the energy, but this energy is lower than this energy. That's why you can see that here they are much darker, and here the darkness is somewhat less, right. And again above 2500 Hz there is no frequency component. It's not that there is no frequency component, the frequencies may be there, right, but those frequencies have very insignificant energy. That means the energy that is associated with these frequency components may be 1000 times lower than the energy that is associated by this. So because of that, you can able to see when you normalize across maximum to minimum, you can see that these frequency components the observed to be white, right, in the with respect to energy, and whereas these frequency components observed to be like somewhat gray color, and again you can see there are certain frequency components that are very dark. So it means that here these frequency components have very high energy, right, because we normalized with respect to the maximum to minimum for the whole sentence. So therefore you can able to see that wherever the thick dark patches are there, so those indicates that so at those regions the frequencies having very higher energy and all, right. So here that way the spectrogram is nothing but it's like a stacking of the spectra corresponds to a frames, sequence of frames. So here there are 2000 frames are there. So for the first frame you put the whatever the frequency components are there and their strengths you can represent over here. Then you take the second frame, then you represent there. Then take the third frame, you represent there. So likewise here the spectrogram is nothing but just plotting the spectra corresponds to each of the frame in a consecutive way that results a spectrogram. Here. So here there are two types of spectrograms. So one is known to be wideband spectrogram and other one is known to be narrowband spectrogram. So here the top one is the wideband spectrogram and the bottom one is the narrowband spectrogram. And here in case of wideband spectrogram, here these two spectrograms almost indicating the similar information, but if you want to have more resolution in a temporal scale, if you want to visualize the spectral details more with respect to the temporal resolution with more temporal with respect to time, then better to go with the this one, the wideband spectrogram. Because in case of wideband spectrogram we will take the frame duration equals to smaller one about 10 milliseconds, right, and then we will shift the frame by for every 1 millisecond. So therefore you can able to see the spectral details very accurately with respect to the temporal resolution, right. And whereas here in case of narrowband spectrogram, here we will take a speech segment, the time duration of a speech segment is about 40 to 50 milliseconds, right. And here the filters that are used will be of narrow band, that means the filter bandwidth will be around 20 to 30 hertz and all. So therefore here in case of if you want to have a more frequency resolution, then it's better to go for a narrowband spectrogram and all. At a broader level, both the spectrograms indicate a rough information about how the frequency content, what is the frequency content in this particular speech signal, and then how the energy is distributed. All this information will be observed in both the spectrograms. But if you want to have more temporal resolution on the spectrum, then better to go with the wideband spectrogram. And if you want to have more frequency resolution or spectral resolution, then better to go with the narrowband spectrogram and all. So in case of wideband spectrogram, you can able to observe the striations in the vertical direction. So here the striations indicating the pitch period or the periodicity in the speech signal and all. So because we are taking a smaller window, in that window when it exactly fits the pitch, then when we move to the next one, so where you don't see a periodic pattern, you don't see complete, so therefore you can see somewhat less spectral details. So that way you can able to see these striations in the vertical direction or with respect to temporal scale. Whereas here we did the other way. Here we have taken a longer speech segment, and whereas to create a more frequency resolution, we have taken the filter bands, the bandwidth of the filters will be very small, so that you can able to observe very detailed frequency resolution. So therefore whatever the periodicity that is observed in the given segment, that you can able to see in the form of these horizontal striations and all, the horizontal striations. So that way this is the middle one is a narrowband spectrogram, the upper one is a wideband spectrogram and all, right. So with these spectrograms you can able to see more details. So that depending upon the sound signal, depending upon the sound unit, you can able to see that the corresponding in the total frequency range, there are some, if you observe here in these spectrograms at a very gross level, you can able to see the patches, like at any instant of time you can able to see some 4 or 5 patches or 3 to 4 patches, dominant patches. It means suppose for example with respect to the sound unit, if you look at here, there are dark patches here at a low frequency, and somewhere here a frequency around 1500 and frequency around 300, 400 and all, and the frequency around 2500 and the frequency around 3500. So likewise, if you take, and here for example for this particular sound unit, if you look at, there is a frequency content, the dominant frequency content at low frequency, that is below 500, and the dominant frequency around 2000 to 3000, and then afterwards there is a slight lesser. So here in this case the significant frequencies are this and this, whereas if you look at here, we have a dominant frequencies here in the range of up to 1000, right, and afterwards you have a dominant around 2300, 2400, and then we have around 3500. So likewise, if you observe these spectrograms, for every sound unit roughly like you can have like a 3 or 4 dominant ranges of frequencies, that is not dominant ranges of frequency, 3 or 4 ranges of frequencies where the significant energy will be observed in those frequency ranges and all, right. So this is because of the resonances that are offered by the vocal tract. When you utter ah, that depending upon the shape of the vocal tract, like in the frequency range of 0 to 5 kilohertz, so at 3 different ranges, the entire energy, the most of the energy, around 95% of the energy will be distributed to only those 3 narrow frequency ranges, right. So those frequencies are nothing but the resonant frequencies offered by the oral cavity at that particular point of a time for a given sound unit. So likewise, you can able to observe here in the spectrograms, there are like 3 to 4 dominant frequencies, right, ranges of frequencies that are observed, that is because of observation of these dark patches. And so based on these frequencies, the range of frequencies, you can able to discriminate the sound units to some extent too, because you can see here for every sound unit you can have the distinct bands of frequencies, right. For this particular sound unit, you can see that there is a frequency band here, frequency band over here, and for this there is a frequency band here up to this point, you have a single frequency band which covers from low frequency to up to 1500, and afterwards here we have a separation. So that way there are some distinct properties that can be observed in the spectrogram. So with that, with practice or with more and more observations, one can able to distinguish or one can able to discriminate the sound units based on the spectrogram to some extent. But in the time domain, it is very difficult to discriminate the sound units based on the time. In the time domain, you can able to distinguish or you can able to identify whether the speech segment is a voiced segment or unvoiced segment, or is it due to pause. So that information you can able to observe, but beyond that, the discrimination of sounds is very difficult in the time domain. So now we move on to the next slide. So this is just a continuation to the previous one. So here this particular, here we have given the spectrogram in the top, spectrogram at the top, and this spectrogram is corresponds to a speech utterance of why do I owe you a letter, why do I owe you a letter. So this is the speech utterance, and for that speech utterance, right, if you plot the spectrogram, as I mentioned, like how to plot the spectrogram, how to generate the spectrogram. So generating a spectrogram is nothing but first we will divide the speech into frames, sequence of overlapping frames. For every frame we will compute a spectrum, and then stacking those spectra in a consecutive way with respect to time is nothing but a spectrogram and all. So that way if you look at this spectrogram, so this spectrogram corresponds to a speech utterance, why do I owe you a letter, and by observing the spectrogram I can say that this spectrogram is a wideband spectrogram. Why? Because you can able to observe the striations in the vertical direction, So it means that the spectral, you can able to see more the spectral resolution with respect to temporal domain and all. So because we are taking a smaller speech segment, a smaller speech segment frame duration, so therefore you can able to see that, you can see that frequencies will be almost like it's present in a vertically you cannot resolve it, but horizontally you can able to resolve it. And these vertical striations, because as we have taken a smaller window, so as you move the window, so whenever the window just properly occupies the entire period, then you can able to see a clear spectrum and all. And then as it moves on, then the spectral details will be slightly diminished, and so that is the reason that you can able to observe these vertical striations. And the spacing between the vertical striations, so that indicates the periodicity or the pitch, or you can say that the time period. You can say that the time period or the duration of a period and all. So it's nothing but the spacing between the striations in the time. Here, if you observe with respect to time domain, if you just compute the spacing between these striations, it's nothing but it's equivalent to close to the duration of a period. The duration of a period. So this is your spectrogram, and now the bottom figure is nothing but it's known to be the Forman plot. So I'm just introducing a new term here, the new terminology. So here, as I mentioned that in the spectrogram you observe 3 or 4 or 5 maximum frequency ranges you are observing, where you have the most of the energy is concentrated in those frequency ranges, because since we sampled the speech signal at 10 kilohertz or 10,000 samples per second, the frequencies that are present in that speech signal will be up to 5 kilohertz, right? But in that frequency range, the energy will be distributed only in the 3 or 4 frequency ranges, right? So if you look at any point, you can able to see that, for example, here in this case, here you can see that the frequency, the energy is concentrated here in low frequency, and afterwards the energy is concentrated around 2 kilohertz, and the energy is concentrated around 3 kilohertz and around 4 kilohertz. That means a range of frequencies over here. It's not that the energy is distributed in the entire frequency range uniformly. The energy is distributed only at 3 or 4 frequency ranges. The entire energy is focused or mostly concentrated in these 3 or 4 frequency ranges or 4 frequencies around the frequencies, and those frequencies are known to be resonant frequencies, right? And here in the speech processing, we call those resonant frequencies as the formants or the formants. So the formants are nothing but the frequency ranges where the most of the energy is focused or most of the energy is concentrated, right? So those are known to be the formants, or or you can say that the frequencies where the most of the energy will be captured. The frequency ranges where the most of the signal energy will be captured by those frequency ranges and all, right? So here this is the spectrogram, and for the visualization, for the analysis purpose, or for the later for computational purpose, for the by a machine or by some other means, it's difficult to handle the spectrogram directly. So therefore here we will try to derive the format plots is nothing but the format tracks is nothing but the frequency ranges, right? How the energy distribution is taking place. For example, if you want to utter the sentence, why do I owe you a letter, and this is the spectrogram, and from this what we can observe here is that the energy of the signal is distributed at some specific frequency ranges, and those frequency ranges also varying with respect to time. That is because of the sound units that are produced. So for deriving those frequency ranges, right, instead of range of frequencies, we will take some center frequency or a mean frequency of the band, and then we will track that. For every frame we will try to identify that, so how the energy is concentrated, and we will take some 3 or 4 dominant frequencies where the highest energy is present. Likewise, for every frame we will try to compute the dominant frequencies. Here the dominant frequencies means the frequencies where they attain the highest energy or the maximum energy and all. So that way for every frame we will try to compute those dominant frequencies, and then we will plot those frequencies, dominant frequencies, with respect to time, because for every frame we have a set of dominant frequencies, either 3 or 4 or 2 likewise, right? And if we plot all those dominant frequencies for every frame in a consecutive, in a sequential way, then we can get these frequency tracks. We can get these tracks of the the format tracks. That means here you can see F1, F2, F3, F4, F5. This is according, F1 means the lower format, or you can say that the low frequency range where the energy is focused or concentrated. F2 is the next higher frequency, F3 is the next higher frequency, and F4 is the next higher frequency, and so on. So this is known to be formant plot. So by looking at the formant plot, we can clearly, it's more clearer than compared to the spectrogram, and this formant plot is derived from the spectrogram only, right? And from this formant plot we can see that the energy is here, the lower formant is varying, is slightly rising here, then afterwards lowering, then varying like this, and here the lowering or raising or lowering of the formants, that depending upon the sound units, whatever the sound unit that is uttered accordingly, because each sound unit has uttered because of different shape in the vocal tract, in the oral cavity, right? As I mentioned example, a, e, u, a, you yourself experience that for different sounds, right, the vocal tract will be in a different shape. So accordingly the corresponding resonances will be produced. As we know that's a very simple theory of have a tube and have tuning fork. By exciting the tube with a tuning fork, you can see that based on the structure of the tube, dimensions of the tube, the frequencies that are observed, the frequencies that are resonated will be different. The same principle over here also, because of the different shapes that is offered by the vocal tract for different sound units, you can have different dominant frequencies, right? So based on these dominant frequencies, one can able to comment, or one can able to discriminate the sounds to some extent, So now here I just introduced a term, a new terminology known to be formant. So the formants are nothing but, in the context of speech processing, formants nothing but the frequencies which have the significant energy and all. And they are numbered like, they are named like F1, F2, F3, F4, F5. So like F1 indicate the lower frequency, then F2 is the next higher frequency, F3, F4, and so on. Yeah, next we just another plot where here this is again my time domain plot and its corresponding frequency domain plot, right? Nothing but spectrogram. Here always we are not saying frequency domain plot because here we are plotting the spectra corresponds to the frames of several frames, like, and then stacking them one after another in a horizontal way. So that forms a spectrogram, right? So therefore here it's a time and time frequency representation of a speech. So this is the time domain representation of a speech, and this is the time frequency representation of a speech. That means with respect to each time, what are the frequency components that are there in the time domain signal, so that you can able to observe from the spectrogram. And here this particular signal corresponds to a speech utterance of should we chase. So from this should we chase, you can see that if you analyze that the sound units that are present over here are sh, u, d. That means the should consists of three sound units, sh, u, d. There are three sound units that contributes to the word should. We, o, and the e, like kind of a thing. We means it's kind of a diphthong, like u and e. There are two vowels together gives you the sound like ui. Then chase, again it consists of sound units such as ch, a, z. Three sound units. That means altogether we have about, like, there are 8 sound units are there, right? And you can able to see clearly the nature of those sound units, how they are reflected in the time domain and frequency domain, right? So in case of time domain, the first sound unit is sh. So sh is the, like, you can see that the sh is produced due to like unvoiced excitation, because for production of sh, where we will try to close the vocal tract, but we are not closing completely. There is some narrow opening will be there, with that the air will be rushed, that acts like excitation. As I mentioned that the unvoiced excitation is of two types. In the unvoiced excitation is produced by complete closure, and then sudden release of that gives you some unvoiced sounds, right? gives you some unvoiced sounds known to be stop sounds. We will see that later. And the other unvoiced sounds are produced due to when you if we will try to close the completely the vocal tract, but you don't close it completely. There will be some partial opening or partial narrow opening will be there. With that, the air will be rushed, and that becomes excitation. So that results a sound in it sh, like so. Because this is unvoiced excitation, you can see in the time domain case where you can see a noise, like you have some random noise fluctuations are there. So that here you don't observe because the entire signal is plotted in very short length. So therefore you don't see the details. Suppose if we zoom it in horizontally, or if we expand, if we stretch this waveform in a horizontally, you can see the details. You can see the random fluctuations over here. Shh. Then oo, it's a voiced sound, and that you can able to see here the periodic patterns that can able to observe with higher amplitude. And then should we, again we is again voiced, so that corresponds to the voiced excitation. And afterwards chase, ch, 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 it is again due to like unvoiced thing, where you can able to see here this unvoiced manifestation in the time domain, like noisy. And then a, it's again a voiced one, so you can see the voiced excitation in the time domain. Then again z, chase, that again a noisy excitation, unvoiced excitation, this one. So the corresponding voiced and unvoiced, so those things you can clearly see. More detailed ones you can able to observe in the spectrogram. You can see sh, right, it's unvoiced one. So therefore you can see a noisy pattern kind of a thing. There is no regular pattern, it's noisy pattern. Noisy pattern means we have energy at a higher frequency, but there is no systematic pattern over here. So there is high frequency energy, there are high frequency components where the energy bearing only the high frequency components, the noise, right. And then A, for A, because of the shape of the vocal tract, you can see that the energy will be concentrated at a low frequency, then over here and then over here, right. So there are three frequency ranges where the entire energy, the most of the energy will be shared or will be captured by these frequency ranges. And here you can say this is your F1, maybe around 300, and this is your F2, maybe around 1600, and this is your third format like F3, it's about 2400, something like that, right. Should we chase, likewise we have the other sound units that are manifested over here, right. And here this is corresponds to should we, right. It's a diphthong, right. This is a combination of two vowels, right. The two vowels which are very in the close proximity that will be uttered. So that way you can see here at the beginning like oo, and then otherwise ye was there. So accordingly the corresponding format frequencies resulted of this one we, diphthong, and likewise the other frequency components. We will see the details in the next class, right. So we will stop here at this point, and in the next class we will continue further. Thank you. Now we will stop here and we will continue in the next class. Thank you.